Welcome to the TIA Cohort D Application Release webinar. Our objectives are to be able to advise districts on how Cohort D application differs from previous versions of the application and why, advise districts on changes to both the content and format of the Cohort D TIA application, and use some best practices and resources. Our agenda will be first to discuss lessons learned, an overview of changes made, specific highlighted changes, and using best practices and resources. We will start with lessons learned. First, what worked well? 26 Cohort A districts have been approved, which means more than 3,900 designated teachers have been designated throughout the state of Texas. We also have 7 Cohort B and 51 Cohort C districts approved at the system review level. Cohort B's data review will be going on throughout February, and Cohort D is in their data capture year right now. Positive feedback on technical support. We've received lots of positive feedback both from districts and education service centers that the technical support districts have gotten around TIA has been helpful. We also got information that extending and changing deadlines due to the impact of COVID was appreciated. We pushed back the deadlines in the spring so that people could have more time to get their application in. And also we heard that giving districts a chance to clarify applications or resubmit if they needed to, if something wasn't clear, was helpful. Some things that we heard in terms of room for improvement. Character limits did not work. The idea was that we could limit the number of characters and answers so that districts didn't feel they had to write more and it wouldn't become a cumbersome application. However, what happened was that there wasn't enough characters allowed for districts to give us full and complete answers. So unfortunately, that did not work. We heard that loud and clear. So we have removed that to make sure that districts can give us enough, have enough space to answer the questions fully. Secondly, we had optional questions in the application, and the idea was that those would be guides to think about these questions as you answer the question. However, many people didn't answer the optional questions because they were labeled as optional, so that was something that didn't work. There was also a little bit of confusion around optional components to the system versus an other student growth measure. So there's lots of ways that districts can use student growth measures. You do have to have a student growth measure. What's optional are additional components to the system beyond student growth and teacher observation. For example, districts can choose to use student surveys or parent surveys or other optional components if they wish. So we've tried to clarify that on this application for Cohort D. A couple of the questions wording didn't seem to be as clear as it could have been, so we fixed that. We heard that there's a clear need for support around observation trend data and correlation of observation data to growth data. So you will see upcoming, there'll be webinars on both of these topics so we can support districts applying for TIA. And finally, there's a clear need for support around student growth measures and spending plan and funding timelines. So the spending plan and funding and when teachers get paid and when the allocation happens to the district and all of those things is something that we're going to be putting out more guidance on that as we go forward as well. There was something that we thought worked and didn't work at the same time. So we had this idea of iterative feedback. Districts were given the opportunity to clarify answers and resubmit if their original answer was partial or incomplete. So districts did appreciate the second chance. However, they had to go back and rework their answers in many cases, which made it the extra work. So it sort of was a good thing, but also a time-consuming thing at the same time. We're going to move on now to some overview of the changes that we made. So in terms of content, we combined 2 tabs. We tried to make it a little bit less, a little shorter, I guess. So with 2 of the different tabs, we combined into 1. We included all of the questions that formerly were optional so that we can make sure everyone's giving us answers that we can actually score. We clarified some more questions to make them more specific. And then we added a couple of sections on a few different tabs just to make sure we're setting districts up for success regarding data submission. The first one was the merging of 2 tabs. We had a system development tab, which was all about stakeholder engagement in developing the system. And then we had another tab on communication, which was about stakeholder engagement ongoing. And we decided just to combine those 2 into 1 and call it system development and stakeholder engagement. So there'll be 1 fewer tab in the Cohort D application. Next, we had some questions, as I mentioned, that were optional, but now they are required. And the goal is to make sure that districts have enough information in their answers in order for the application to be scored. In some cases, by calling questions optional, we actually didn't have enough information to score the answer, and we had to go back and have them re-answer those questions. So now they're actually required. And you can see on this slide, there's a couple of examples of questions that were formerly optional, but now are actually required questions on the Cohort D application, such as, is there a plan in place to provide specific outreach to teachers regarding updates to TIA? We also decided we were going to get more specific on the wording of our questions, and a shift from listing questions as guidance to asking them directly. And again, the goal is to ensure that districts have enough information included in their answer that they can get as close as possible to a full readiness answer at the first time. So an example here, as you can see before, the question was, how are any skew or irregularity issues in teacher observation trends addressed at the campus and district level? And you can see the after version is much more specific. How does the district determine the root cause of any skew in teacher observation data? How does the district determine whether a teacher needs additional support, the appraiser needs additional support, and using the rubric fidelity, or both? We also added some options for our small rural districts. We have many rural districts in Texas that have only a single appraiser, for example, or possibly one or two appraisers. And so using words that are meant for larger districts seemed like it didn't really apply to some of our small districts. For example, saying which departments are in charge of this particular aspect. In some small districts, they're not departments, it's just one person or it's two people. So we're trying to be sensitive to that. Instead of saying all appraisers, we have saying just appraiser, maybe there's an S, because like I said, there are districts out there that only have the one appraiser. So to assume that there are many appraisers in every district isn't necessarily a fair thing to do. So we're trying to just make sure we're careful in our language and making sure we honor language that's going to be applicable to both small as well as larger districts. So there are a couple of new sections. One, we added a section on the teacher observation tab. It was kind of implied before that the statewide performance standards for teacher observation was a requirement, which of course it is a requirement and it's in statute, but there was no exact question specifically asking that. So we did add that little section to the teacher observation tab, add a question for that. We also had previously a question around the district's plan to recruit, retain, and equitably distribute designated teachers. Now we decided to make those 3 separate questions because by putting them all in one, some pieces got lost. Recruit, retain, equitably distribute. Some districts answered some of them, but not all of them. So we made that much more clear. And now those are going to be 3 separate questions. Data analysis and submission, we did add a section on that, the goal being to ensure a successful data capture year so that districts have the data they need at the end of the year for a successful data submission. And finally, movement of teachers, we did some work on that, including specifics about winter class roster, and I will get to that in a second. We also made changes, in addition to the content changes we just discussed, we also made changes on format. We now have a weighting tab that's been reformatted. There's a completion bar for each section, so you can see how far along you are before that particular section is complete by % of completion. There's also a cross-out feature for words or questions that don't apply to you. For example, if you're using SLOs, say, as a student growth measure, then questions about pre and post test would be crossed out, so you know you don't have to answer questions unless they apply to you. There also will be checkboxes to identify which assessment is used for which eligible teaching assignment. Now I'm going to go over some specific highlighted changes and show you what they look like. Here are some highlights we've made of changes to the Cohort D application. First off, we have the weighting tab. If you look at the column that says measure, you can see that it's the same student growth measure, pre-post test, for all 3 eligible teaching assignments. There are 3 eligible teaching assignments in this district. They have map tested teachers grade K through 3, map tested teachers grades 5 and 8 in science, and high school social studies, 4th grade through high school social studies. So there are 3 different teaching assignments. Their growth measure looks like it's all the same, pre and post test, pre-post test, pre-post test. However, the actual test they're using for each of these 3 different groups is a different test. Previously, the weighting tab just listed the measure, but did not have districts specify the name of the test that was used. In this case, for Teaching Group 1, they're using the NWA MAP test. In Teaching Group number 2, they're using the STAR test. And for Teaching Group number 3, they're using the Iowa assessments. So this is something that is going to really help us discern which assessment is used for which teaching group, which previously was not clear. We also are really trying to make a difference between large districts and medium districts versus very small districts. In Texas, we have quite a number of small districts with maybe 1 or 2 appraisers in the district, maybe 15 or 20 teachers, and so forth. So some of the questions that we asked, questions like at the campus level versus at the district level, are not the same if you only have 1 campus in the district and the district is 1 campus. Then there doesn't make sense to ask different questions about at the district level versus at the campus level, since in these districts it's the same thing. So there's just different questions that we're trying to ask just to be sensitive to the fact that in a very, very small district, some of the context is different and some of the questions therefore are going to be different on this application. The next piece we wanted to highlight is movement of teachers. So one area that we really wanted to make sure we were clear on is the movement of designated teachers. A district's allocation is based on where the designated teachers are on the class roster winter submission date, which is usually in late February. The districts will receive allocation funds for eligible designated teachers who show up as being employed in the district on the class roster winter submission date. So if a designated teacher left, say at the end of the fall semester, she would not be there on the class roster winter submission date, which is in February, and therefore the district would not receive an allocation for that teacher, even though that teacher worked in the district from September through December. The reverse is also true. If a designated teacher was employed in the district on the class roster winter date, but then left, say, in March 1st, the district would receive the full allocation funds for that teacher, which would have to be spent on teacher compensation on the campus where the designated teacher worked. It would not all have to be given, or any of it would have to be given to the designated teacher herself if she left, or it could. These are all local decisions that we really want to make sure districts are talking about and thinking about and having a clear plan for what they're going to do if a designated teacher leaves before or after that class roster winter submission date. I encourage you to take a look at the TIA application for Cohort D, which is on the TIA website at tiatexas.org. If you want to get some more specific information about what the new application looks like, please take a moment to give yourself a little tour through the application and look at the new features. At this time, we're going to be moving on to some best practices and resources. So one of the best practices is to use the Readiness Checklist. Pay attention to the weighting tab, like we mentioned before, making sure each eligible teaching assignment is clear what their student growth measure is for each one. Answering all the questions. We had some districts that turned in applications that didn't answer all the questions on the application, so that's something that's definitely a best practice, is to answer all the questions as fully as possible. Checking answers against the scoring rubric is a best practice, and of course using the resources on tiatexas.org. Here are some helpful hints that we've learned from districts in cohorts A through C who had successful system applications and passed the system application process. First off, they used the Readiness Checklist as a self-assessment early on and shared it with stakeholders. I'm going to be modeling that process for you in just a moment. Second, when actually completing the application itself, using the scoring rubric as a guide to ensure that your answers will meet full readiness. We don't recommend starting out using the scoring rubric because it is very specific and much more detailed. We recommend beginning with the Readiness Checklist as a self-assessment that has the big picture pieces and moving on from there. Third, having appropriate people working on each respective piece of the system application. There are several parts. There's many tabs. There's a student growth tab. Maybe your assessment folks might work on that tab. There's a spending tab, and that might be wise to have your budget and finance person working on that piece. Again, for some small districts, all these people are the same person, so we understand that. But if you are a larger district with lots of moving parts, it's a good idea to have each respective department or group of people working on each respective part of the application to make sure that the district is in sync. Next, answering questions thoroughly. I mentioned that, giving as much information as you can and as you need to answer the question. And this is the reason why we removed the character limits, to make sure that districts had enough space to really answer the question thoroughly so that it can be scored and that it can align as closely as possible, hopefully, with the full readiness indicators. Next, accessing resources and reaching out with questions as much as you need. Districts that reach out to the TIA team or sent emails to the TIA inbox that used all the resources that we have on the website. There's one-pagers on student growth measures, there's teacher observation protocols, there's teacher calibration protocols, there's all kinds of resources there. And we found that districts that used those and that called us with questions had a much higher success rate of passing system approval. So please use those resources and reach out as much as you need. And finally, the more teacher input on the design of the system itself, the more teacher buy-in the districts had. For some districts, it's a big deal. This is a lot. It's something new to do TIA. It's kind of a shift in mindset. And the more teacher input they had on the design, the more buy-in they had, and the happier they are. So that's just something we've noticed, kind of lessons learned based on our cohort A through C districts. I want to spend a moment on the readiness checklist. The readiness checklist, we'll be doing another webinar specifically on how to use the readiness checklist. In this presentation, I'm just going to give a very brief overview. Essentially, it's a great tool to use as a self-assessment of readiness to apply for the teacher incentive allotment. It's used to describe the district's current context regarding each success factor, creating a list of questions and information needed. Sometimes starting out, the people looking at the readiness checklist don't have all the answers. For example, let's say our principal is looking at the readiness checklist. That principal may or may not know all of the human resources details that are going to be coming out, may not know or be aware of all the finance pieces that are going to be part of the application. And so making sure that there's a question list that's created so districts know what questions and information they need to know to be able to complete the application successfully. And finally, determining next step based on those questions that you had or information needed. How do you decide what your next steps are so that you can align your next steps to a successful TIA application? The readiness checklist is located here. Again, it's on our website at tiatexas.org. Please check it out. It looks kind of like this. This is an example of one key practice. So the success factor that I'm going to use as an example is teacher observation. And there are many pieces to this. I just pulled out one, key practice C, which is around district review of teacher observation trends. Full readiness in this key practice looks like districts implementing a plan for observation trends in various ways, looking at trends in various ways, addressing root causes if there's any skew in those trends, using a data observation management system. And we also put in there, if a district doesn't already have one, there is a free one if districts are using T-tests. You can get at teachfortexas.org, which is a data management system, to pull those reports out of how do we know what our observation trends are by appraiser, by department, by teacher, by demographics, and so forth. So making sure that those trends are being looked at and reviewed, and any kind of skew in those trends is addressed. So that's what full readiness looks like. In my sample district, Daffodil ISD, here's what their current context is with respect to this key practice. District leaders review appraisal ratings at the end of the year. District leaders look at observation trends by campus, but do not look at trends by appraisers, by subject or grade level, by dimension of T-tests, etc. So they're looking at some trends, but not all. They wouldn't meet full readiness at this moment in time. District does not have a clear plan to address areas of skew or determine root causes. District uses the T-test data management system. And district has PD for teachers to improve instructional practice, but does not have PD for school leaders to increase appraiser effectiveness. So that's what Daffodil ISD, that's their current context right now. So then there's a worksheet you can use, which again, you can find on the TIA website. I'm using still as this example, district review of observation trends. In this case, they were yellow, and so they ended up with questions. First question they asked themselves was, how do we get observation trend data reports by subject and grade level, by dimension of T-tests, by appraiser. Who's responsible for this? Right now in Daffodil, they're only looking at it by campus, but they realize they need to look at it through all these other slices, but they're not exactly sure how to do that or who is going to do it. So that's a question. Their next question is, what process will we use to determine root causes of any skew that we find? What are we going to do about it? And then finally, what PD can we provide to all appraisers to improve their effectiveness and increase their accuracy in appraising teachers? So those are their questions that they had. And then that led to their next steps for Daffodil, which are, with assistance from data experts in the district and from their ESC, they are going to develop the regular process of running all observation trend reports, all the ones that are needed based on that readiness checklist success factor C in teacher observation. So they're going to do that. They're also going to develop a protocol to analyze observation trends across all the different slices at least quarterly. They're going to provide technical assistance to campus leadership teams on determining the root cause of skew in data and provide them time to do so. And that last piece I want to emphasize, for some districts, this feels like a lot of work. It feels like additional work or extra work. So in Daffodil ISD, they want to be really sensitive to that. They realize that most campuses have a campus leadership team that meet regularly anyway. And so they're going to make it a part of their agenda that they will provide them with these reports and looking at all this skew and give them time during their regular meeting agenda to determine what are some root causes and why is our data showing up this way. And then the last part there is they want to restructure at the district level. They have monthly principal meetings of this district. This is a district that has more than one campus and more than one principal. So they're going to restructure their time with principals to include regular calibration protocols. So they're going to move out some of their administrative things, move those to email or webinar format, and during the actual principal time, they're going to do calibration walkthroughs together, all the leaders together doing walkthroughs, scoring together to practice calibrating. So they're going to just restructure their time to make sure that they're focusing on appraisal to get better at appraising. So that's Daffodil's context. Every district is going to have a completely different context, but I really recommend using the readiness checklist, pulling out a key success factor, and analyzing or assessing what is your district's current status, what's your current context with respect to that success factor or that key practice, and then what questions do you need to have answered, and finally, what are your next steps? Resources for this will be on the TIA website, and we will also have a more detailed webinar where districts can walk through this exact process coming up later this month. And again, the process is, with your district in mind, select one of the indicators for a particular success factor, draft the context for your district with respect to this indicator. Are you green, yellow, or red? Green being we're there, yellow meaning we've got pieces of it, we're kind of there, but we're missing some stuff. Red being we're not close. And then what questions should you ask yourself based on that? And finally, what potential next steps would you recommend in order to align to that readiness checklist? So this is something that districts can use to determine which cohort they're in, and also to, as they craft their plan itself, making sure they're aligned to best practices. This is what it's going to look like, this resource that we're going to have on our website. It's up on our website. You can look at each key practice. Again, I just did one sample. With the whole readiness checklist is available. I just picked out one slice. Your self-assessment in this area. What is your context for your ISD? Are you green, yellow, or red in this indicator? What questions would you ask yourselves? And then what are your potential next steps? Just like I outlined for Daffodil ISD. Cohort D Scoring Rubric. This is the last piece that we're going to talk about. This is the scoring rubric. This is a resource to use when it's time to begin the actual application itself. So not when you're planning it, not when you're designing it, not when you're in the beginning stages. That would be the readiness checklist. But when you get down to actually completing the application itself for Cohort D, that's going to be due in April. This is when you can look at the scoring rubric. It has very detailed answers for every single question on the application. It includes what's full and what's not. It comes after using the readiness checklist to begin designing your plan. It includes which pieces are statutory and which pieces are not statutory. And again, it does note some best practices. You can find the link to the scoring rubric on our website. So sometimes we get the question, the readiness checklist and the scoring rubric, they seem very similar. What's the difference? And that's a great question. So I'm going to attempt to answer that here. The readiness checklist, as I mentioned, is to use before you start. It's when you're building the system itself to determine your readiness and your next steps. It also can be used to determine which cohort you're in. For example, if you're wanting to be a Cohort D district and you have not started, there's a district that hasn't started, they haven't done any stakeholder engagement at this point, people in their district aren't even sure what TIA is yet because they haven't done any of that pre-work, likely that district would not be a Cohort D district, more like a Cohort E district, because you need a full year to plan and build and make sure your system is strong and make sure it will meet full readiness when you do apply, make sure you have buy-in at the local level. So when you're going through the readiness checklist, you'll be able to see, oh yeah, we're there, we're good, we'll be ready by April. We started this last summer. We might say, oh, we actually aren't there and we're going to wait. We want to wait and make sure when we apply, we're likely to be approved. And so if we need more time, we need more time. So that's a great way to start, like deciding which cohort are you. It's also a guide to use once you decide which cohort you're in and you're building your system itself. It's a very handy reference for stakeholders. It has full transparency of what exactly is being looked for on the TIA application, and it's a great overview of like the big picture. The scoring rubric, on the other hand, is a much longer document. It's 12 pages long. It has much more detail. It provides a question-by-question look at full readiness. It also includes partial readiness and what that looks like in detail, and limited readiness and what that looks like in detail. It's very handy to use when you get down to completing the application itself. I don't recommend using it when you're building the application because it's very, very specific and it's kind of in the weeds. It is in the weeds in a good way, however, when you are down to completing the application, you're answering those questions and you can see, did I provide enough information in this answer that's going to lead to full readiness? So that's kind of how the two documents are different. Both are available, both are on the website. You can use both of them as you see fit. This is just a quick example of when you're filling out the application, how you might use the scoring rubric. So I pulled out an application question. This is a question from a district that's using SLOs as a student growth measure, and I picked out question number 6 just for an example. Question number 6 is, what are the district-wide requirements for tracking the body of evidence for an SLO? So Marigold ISD, this is their answer. Their answer is, teachers are required to have at least 5 pieces of student work aligned to their SLO in their body of evidence. All assignments, assessments, projects used in the body of evidence must align specifically to the learning objective in order to demonstrate evidence of student progress over time. So that's Marigold ISD's answer. I want you to take a minute, pause the video if you need to, look at this scoring rubric on the bottom of the screen. There's this a snip of the scoring rubric for this particular question, question number 6, requirements for tracking a body of evidence for an SLO. And you'll see there on the left is limited readiness, the middle is partial readiness, and on the far right is full readiness. Read those descriptors for limited, partial, and full, and see where would you score Marigold ISD? What would you give Marigold ISD if that was their answer and you were using this scoring rubric to score the answer? Take a minute and decide how you would score that, partial, limited, or full. This answer would be full. You can see that the answer that Marigold gave aligns to the specific descriptors under full readiness. They do have clear procedures in place. They're tracking a body of evidence. They have a minimum number of pieces required for their body of evidence. They have multiple data points used. They have it aligned to the objective. So that would be an example of a full readiness answer for this particular question. Again, I want to just point out, looking at the TIA website, there's a lot of resources on the TIAtexas.org website. There are resources for student growth, there's resources for calibration, there's resources for looking at skew and teacher observation, there's resources on stakeholder engagement, there's actually a lot of information on data upload. So you can look at, for cohorts A and B, what exactly when we say data checks and data upload, what do we mean exactly? You can look and see what was required to submit for data in cohorts A and B to give you an idea for what your data submission would look like for cohort D. So please use that website as a resource. If you have any questions, reach out to our team. You can reach us at the TIA inbox. which is tiatexas.org, and TIA@tea.texas.gov. That's our TIA inbox. So please email us, contact us, let us know how we can help you so you can have a successful TIA application. Thank you so much for your time.